What is feudalism? Now, feudalism is a system primarily found in Europe from 600 to about 1800 AD, though other regions such as North Africa, the Middle East, or Japan can reasonably be described as feudal as well, though there are a lot of local differences between them, so it's not easy to generalize across all of them, but they share a lot of characteristics. But for simplicity here, I will just be talking about feudalism from 900 to 1500 AD. Western Europe specifically. The reason for this narrowing is while feudal system does start to exist after about 600-ish, after the migration period has really started slowing down, it's not entrenched and it's not organized yet. And after 1500, with the advent of gunpowder and the infantry revolution, feudalism starts unwinding. And it doesn't take very long for the armored nobleman to cease to be the preeminent force on the battlefield. And at this point, feudalism mostly perpetuates from inertia. The core reasons for its creation no longer apply. Now, to understand feudalism, let us discuss the three main building blocks of it: cavalry, castles, and a weak central government. Cavalry. The armored horseman was the dominant force on the European battlefield. Knights were what decided the outcome of battles, and for a state to survive, they needed to field as many as possible. Now, there are countless battles you can look at throughout the medieval period and just slightly before and just slightly after, where the only force that mattered was knights. Armored, mounted knights. Yes, you can point to exceptions to these rules, such as Crécy or Agincourt, where the armored, mounted horseman was not the deciding arm of the battle. But for every Crécy you can find a Battle of Kirkholm. In fact, there's so many of these examples of the knights preeminently dominating the battlefield. It is all but impossible to study any quantity of medieval military history without stumbling across dozens of every time period of every state. The armored knight is the weapon of the day. But the armored knight is extremely expensive to field. Not only are war horses incredibly expensive to train, raise, and replace if they die on the battlefield, and die on the battlefield they do, but the knight himself in his gear is incredibly expensive. Even in the earliest periods, full suits of chainmail armor, going up into the end of the period, full suits of plate. This is not cheap equipment. It is not something the average person can acquire. It requires incredible amounts of resources and incredible amounts of time. But more than just the cost of the equipment, to be competitive militarily, the knight needs to be trained almost from birth. If you look at these circles of medieval nobility, what their purpose was to be soldiers. That is why they existed. And it's why later, in periods after feudalism starts unwinding, you have the dichotomy of the nobles of the sword and nobles of the robe. The nobles of the sword draw their history back to when they paid their taxes in blood. To do this, the knight must be trained almost from birth, which is an incredible liability and an incredible burden among a society. This is a time period with 95% farmers. There's not much excess. There's not much economic growth. There's not much economic activity. To commit the resources to fund and equip knights so that your state can survive other states is a monumental task that the society must embrace fully, lest it fail. The other core building block to match this, though, are castles. Castles are a major innovation in defensive technology. Yes, forts and walls had existed for millennia by this point, from the dawn of civilization, but the creation and design and fortification of castles not only advanced rapidly throughout the medieval period, but it was brought even the most basic ancient techniques to a science. The power of castles meant that just a small fortified house, just a lone keep, was all but unassailable to anyone but the most dedicated assailants in the world. A mere garrison of 30 might hold off an army of 500. This is the power of the castle. This allowed small forces of a local noble, a local baron, the lowest tier of the proper nobility, with just his small retinue of knights and men-at-arms, could not only meaningfully protect his vassals, his serfs, but could meaningfully stress and harass an invader. If they are attacked, they can flee back into the walls, and if the invader ignores them, they can go out and harass their supplies. But to take the fortified castle is not an easy undertaking. It's the deciding factor of whether a campaign is successful or not, and most campaigns are not. And finally, we have weak central governments. The king is largely incapable of managing large stretches of land, and there's a critical shortage of educated people to serve in the bureaucracy to help the land, manage the land for him. Part of this shortage is the lack of surplus, as one previously mentioned, and also equivalent is the consumption of more resources for military domain compared to, say, during the Roman period. However, what is more of a drain on the educated and the ambitious is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church needs these men for its bureaucracy, further stretching small, petty kings. However, even if they had these men, it's almost impossible to manage. From the perspective of the king, you have a huge amount of land. Dozens of farms, churches, castle towns, tons and tons of places to manage. And you know that for your military to be powerful, it needs to be cavalry based. However, you do not have the funding to field a large enough army out of your ability to levy taxes. Travel distance, corruption, tax evasion, insufficient bureaucracy, and tax spoilage reduce your revenue too much. One particularly notable example of this is tax spoilage is a major issue because goods are paid in kind. Taxes, are paid in kind. If a farmer makes 10 bushels of grain, he might pay 1 bushel of grain in taxes to the Lord. What does the Lord do with a bushel of grain but eat it? Or, equally, give it to his knights for food. But if you get too much food and transport for too long, the food spoils. And you do not have the other ancillary resources to sustain it. To actually spend the resources to use the food you've collected. With this in mind, though, the general problem is the king, because of the lack of not only educated men, but trustworthy educated men. And additionally, the risk of bandits. The king is really only able to manage land that he can personally visit on a whim. This means for every extra day the king's core advisors or himself need to travel to reach a settlement, the less real revenue they can collect from those settlements. Just as a way of example, imagine a town but 100 miles away from the capital. That would take at least 5 days to travel, if not more. So the king is not going to go there very frequently. One trip to that town takes 10 days. 5 there, 5 back. This means the king and his core advisors, the people he trusts the most, have very little presence there. With the lack of presence, either honestly or dishonestly, people can avoid paying taxes. You can easily underreport what you've harvested, what you've made, etc. And on the way there and back, if the king himself is not there, it could easily be stolen by the intermediary. At least some of it. But even more so, especially as you get even farther than 100 miles, because of the risk of bandits and raids from foreign powers, you need to put more and more men on taxation protection. Whereas if you can just travel there and back for 1 day, you don't really need to have many men dedicated to this. Your men dedicated for defending your capital and collecting the taxes are one and the same. But if your men must travel for 5 days out and 5 days back, they cannot be the same as the ones providing security to the capital. They must be different soldiers. This means the further they have to travel, the more soldiers you need, and the less net revenue you can actually collect. And at a certain point, the cost in paying soldiers to collect the taxes is more than the taxes themselves. At this point in a realm, the outer settlements effectively are ungoverned. It's not worth it for the central government to protect them. And this creates a natural maximum size for a kingdom, for a domain. If it's implausible for the king to protect it, or the king to levy taxes to it, it doesn't exist. Yet we get the corollary. To protect your domain from foreign powers, you need as many knights and as many taxes as possible. This means you want to be as big as possible, because just doubling the radius of control from the central capital squares the area that you have. And since tax revenue and army levies are generally speaking proportional to the area you control and not the linear distance you travel, bigger countries have more power than smaller ones. Especially when we're discussing Western Europe. And as way of a cursory example of what this security problem is, we have the king's army here. This king is quite powerful. He has 3 knights for his 6 farms and 1 church. Powerful lord. But we come in and have blue knights come in, and they are ransacking these outer farming settlements. So the central king sends his army in. He can combat them and defend his outer laying settlements. But on the opposite side of his kingdom, he's now open for a different raid, and his troops are now committed, and he cannot protect the area. The only way to provide the local security on the outer settlements, and not even just to collect taxation, but from raids, is the creation of castles. With these castles in place, there is defense from raids. Your peasants, your serfs will not be slaughtered. Most of their goods can be protected, if not their houses themselves, because of the military presence. Less damage is wrought from such a raid. However, by having these outer castles and outer settlements, we once again increase the demand on taxation the kingdom has. We've already outlined how the further out something is, the more expensive it is to maintain, the more it costs the king to have. This outer castle here, or this one here, with just 1 knight in it, is going to cost more money than the 3 he has back home. Because it's not just the wages of the knight manning the castle, but it's also the wages of the workers in the castle, the transportation of goods to and from the castle, the enforcement to and from the castle, the commitment to have a central army to reinforce the castle, and obviously the maintenance of the castle. It rapidly becomes almost impossible with the resources a noble in feudal Europe has. There's only so much area they can defend, even with outlying castles and outlying towers and bastions. They can only defend and protect so much. And with the inability to provide security, you do not have a realm. The basic contract of a society is the peasants pay taxes so they will be protected from raids. If that is failed, you get no taxes. End of story. The solution, though, to this problem outlined here is what feudalism is. Instead of the king directly managing the entire realm and directly paying for every garrison and directly providing security for every single settlement, the king deputizes other families to do this. These other families become the nobility, and they manage these outlying settlements. They collect taxes, they provide local security, and they provide soldiers to the king in war. Now, you might ask yourself, how is this any different than the previous solution? Just putting knights in outer castles. The reason this works and the other solution doesn't is by creating a fractal system where the king rules his domain, but also the kingdom, and the duke rules his domain, but also several vassals, is that at every point, the individual in charge of a domain, from the lowest baron to the king himself, can manage the largest domain one man can manage, but also has the commitments of multiple other men managing the largest domain they can manage. What makes this work isn't the ability to levy more soldiers, isn't the ability to provide better security. Neither of those things are true. The king could provide as good security and as many men, if not for money. What feudalism solves is the taxation problem. It is easier for a king and 30 nobles who are all self-interested working for themselves to collect taxes for the realm than it is one man. Because when it's one man managing a realm, every tax collector is incentivized to be corrupt. The king has no capacity to know how much taxes this settlement is paying. It's too far away, he can't manage it himself. But when the duke collects taxes, there is no corruption. The duke is the one getting the money. This is why feudalism starts. By breaking down the kingdom into a fractal patchwork of domains. Not only do you have it so one man can manage the largest possible land he can, but you have dozens of men doing this. Each one providing maybe only a dozen soldiers. But when you have 5,000 barons, 12 soldiers each is now an army of 60,000. That is how feudalism works. By breaking down administration to the smallest possible seed, the largest countries can be managed in a way that everybody on principle is getting the taxes they need to get the security they need. So now that we have the motivation for the feudal system, how does it actually work? Well, a feudal system is based on obligation. A person's life revolves around the obligations to those above and below them. To walk it through to make it clear, at the bottom of society, down here, You have the peasant. The peasants have an obligation to their liege to pay them taxes, and in many circumstances, some number of days of labor each year. Additionally, the peasant has an obligation to attend church each week, partake in all of the religious events during the year, and pay the tithe to the church. At the same token, though, the peasant has an obligation to his family to provide, protect, and feed. The next level up, you have the baron. The baron has an obligation to his liege to provide him with some quantity of men for a certain number of days each year, usually decided by contract. The baron also has an obligation to protect his peasantry and to manage his estate for the prosperity of all. As an example, a baron will usually build and maintain communal buildings like the flour mill. Above the baron, you have a variable number of tiers of nobility. Depends on the kingdom, depends on the time period, depends on circumstances. Here we will just use the duke for simplicity, but for all of these nobles, the process is the same. Each of these nobles has an obligation to provide military support to his liege and provide military security when needed for his vassals. This is the fractal nature of feudalism. The baron protects his peasants and provides troops to the duke. The duke protects his barons and provides troops to his king. And no matter how many tiers of nobility this is, this stays the same. And it should also be noted that every tier of nobility does, in fact, have their own collection of peasants on their personal domain, which they use to collect their personal revenues to pay for their own soldiers and their own household. In many cases, nobles pay taxes to nobles above them, but not always. That really depends on the country and time period. Though later you get into the medieval period, the more likely nobles pay taxes to other nobles. And at the top of the secular hierarchy here, we have the king, who has an obligation to his vassals, provide them with military security when needed, and a more general obligation to all of his subjects to rule them in the realm in a fair, virtuous manner. Oftentimes, this later one is also referred to as an obligation to God, to be a just Christian ruler. Alongside the secular hierarchy is the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church itself has a very similar hierarchy, with the village parish up to the bishop, up to the archbishop, up to the cardinal, the pope, etc. Though cardinals and archbishops and bishops are all technically the same rank, but that's more complicated. That's a different video. The general principle, though, of the Catholic Church as a whole, if we use this as a side entity to feudalism, a core integral element of feudalism, both culturally and structurally, the Catholic Church has an obligation to God to manage the spiritual health of the community, but also an obligation to their flock to make sure people are living virtuous lives. To step back and generalize, the general rule of thumb is every person in society owes an obligation to the person above and below. And simultaneously, everyone has an obligation to the church, and the church has an obligation to them in return. Nobody has an obligation to nobody. Everyone has an obligation to someone else. And the way this works is your obligation of the baron to the duke is not transferable. The baron has no obligation to the king. He has an obligation to his duke. A baron's serf has an obligation to the baron, but not the duke nor the king. Though everyone has an obligation to the church. And breaking your obligation is seen as one of the worst offenses you could make. To give one example that stuck with me a lot is one of my university classes. The professor was discussing an example between a border war in Scotland and England in the late 1300s. The lord of the castle, who was given a contract from the king to protect this castle for, I believe, 45 days. He had to withstand siege for 45 days or die trying. This lord defected. Gave up the castle to the Scots. And what happened in return? The King of Scotland tried him for breaking his obligation, and he was actually sentenced to death for violating his obligation to the King of England. Now, that particular King of Scotland, I can't remember his name, was particularly known for being stickler to the rules, but this gives you the idea. No one in Scotland or England was outraged by this. It might have seemed zealous to other people, but no one doubted it. That's how important obligations are. The entirety of a feudal society is based and predicated around obligation. You do not do military service to your duke because you like him. You do it because that is your job. You owe him this. It is your duty to mount up and fight with him on the battlefield. A good, honorable lord doesn't just protect his citizens, his peasants, his serfs, because not doing so will hurt him financially. He protects his serfs with his life because that's his job, that's his duty. It's the duty of the knight to die to protect the serf. Now, by no means is this ideal or goal actually upheld by everyone in feudal society. But this is the predicate of the society. This is what it's built around. This is the ideal that you strive towards. The most honorable, best knight fulfills his obligations to the T. The most dishonorable, lamentable knight does not. However, feudal Europe doesn't just have this rigid obligation feudal hierarchy. While we do have the core hierarchy, which is the nobility, which has obligations to and from the peasants, which have obligations to and from the church, which has obligations to and from the nobility, you have this core trifecta, which is feudalism. This is feudalism, this trifecta. But not only do we have this core trifecta, which defines feudalism, we have an outlay to this. A corollary. Both the necessary exception and the exception that inevitably ends feudalism. You have the city. Now, the cities are unique from the rest of feudalism because unlike a manor, unlike a monastery, unlike a church, the city is governed outside of social hierarchy. The mayor of a city is not a noble, is not a prince of the church. It's not even a local of note peasant. The city is run by, usually speaking, elected mayors. Inside a feudal city is a complex, obligation-based guild system. Very similar, but distinct and disjoint from the rest of the feudal system. The city represents a safe haven for people trying to flee obligation from the rest of the feudal system. But it also serves as the necessary glue of the system. The problem with the core trifecta of feudalism is absent cities. There is no engine of economic growth. In principle, you cannot have skilled trades in small manor towns. You need large settlements for both export and import of goods. To have a market for your goods, you need large settlements. You will not find master armor smiths in rural Vendée. You find your master armor smiths in Milan, in Dijon, Paris, other places. There's one I'm thinking of that I can't think of the name of. You don't find your master bladesmiths in Yorkshire. You find your master bladesmiths in places like Toledo. This is what the cities do. They enable the production of high-quality goods, armor, weapons, horses, or just mundane consumer goods like jewelry, food, clothes, etc., that drive surplus and the economy. But they are disjoint from the system. They do not have the same requirements that a peasant on a manor does. Yes, cities pay taxes to their liege, but because of the power of cities, they have their own rights and privileges that do not happen elsewhere. And this is the first inkling of what will later cause the breaking down of feudalism in but 250 years from the end of this period. The patchwork of privileges and rights afforded to different areas eventually undermines feudalism. But with that, I will finish this video here. If you like this style, let me know in the comments below. Comment if you think I missed anything, if you want to see me go into any more detail on anything. But otherwise, if you enjoyed the video, please like, share, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter at BagwellPolling. But with that, I bid you a good day, and I will see you next week.